So let's zoom in on the web brain, which I produced for this purpose, with the excerpts. I will zoom in on the various elements actually mentioned in the strategy. And I will also come back to Turkey in the end, noting that the devil is in the detail, in the concrete cases. NGOs need to learn, of course, to apply a comprehensive approach to security and to human rights. So there are a lot of references in the global strategy to human rights and democracy and to related concepts, and obviously also to the issue of values and interests. There is a statement here that interests and values go hand in hand. And then a statement to put the focus on EU citizens. Both these statements are likely to be closely scrutinized from an NGO perspective. Are we only working for EU citizens? Is there no contradiction between values and interests? Is there a cost associated with promoting values? Or are actually values a part of the soft power of the European Union? The way we can impress upon others. And then, of course, moving on to enlargement, the focus on values is prominent. While focusing on Europe and its neighbors, there is still a strong statement referring to global commitments on the level of the United Nations. This includes international human rights law, international criminal law, support for the International Criminal Court, etc. And then there is the European Security Order and the OSCE, the Helsinki Final Act, the Paris Charter, which for the first time entered the notion of democracy into the context in Europe at the end of the Cold War. Of course, there is a strong link between the OSCE documents and what's happening in Crimea and international law. But what we are focusing on here is a third basket of the OSCE, human rights basket of the OSCE. Then we have the critical question about what states should be able to do in order to fight terrorism, where the EU here focuses on its own cooperation with the neighborhood, asking it to be human rights compliant. We're interrupted here by a boat passing in the channel. Here we come closer to the notion of resilience that I mentioned before. Some people may interpret this concept as meaning that societies should be able to withstand insurgents, etc. Here the focus is on democracy, and there is a link to the effectiveness of the EU as an external actor. The question is, however, if this notion of resilience will be remembered in the debate. Because in the literature, of course, resilience is more in general linked to the question of a system being able to cope with change in general. The notion of democracy is not a natural part of the concept. The mainstreaming of human rights and gender issues across policy sectors and institutions is once more stressed here. This is nothing new. It is a commitment that the EU has made for decades. Again, coming back to resilience, the reasoning is here broadened beyond the neighborhood. From an NGO perspective, this will most likely be characterized as a rather complicated reasoning, as you see, starting to define the resilient state as a democratic state, then proceeding to say that such a state, a democratic state, is key for security, and that in turn is key for prosperity and what? Democracy. So maybe we are close here to a circular definition. And when discussing Turkey, as we did before, the notion of conditionality comes back. Means that we are talking about, to a certain extent, we are talking about changing the nature of a country in order to satisfy enlargement criteria. Come back to that notion later. It's a matter of change. Not regime change in the sense of changing leaders, but it's certainly changing a country. Looking at China, this notion is much less prominent. Here we can see that the human rights aspect is coming rather far down in the discussion, far down in the list here. With Iran, the focus is also different. Here it's more on dialogue, focusing on keeping the space open for cooperation and dialogue and less on conditionality. This is a change from the period of the sanctions, clearly. When dealing with things like migration, there is a requirement introduced for a balanced and human rights compliant policy mix. This again comes back to a discourse which has been underway for many years, related to terrorism, including now also radicalization and violent extremism. It has to be human rights compliant. Then there is a focus on human rights dialogue and human rights protection, including reform of justice, security, defense sector, the democratic control over the military, and in general supporting fragile states. Again, coming back to resilience, there is a reference to governmental accountability and the need to support diversity and NGOs, to support media. So in some areas, in particular in the neighborhood and in the enlargement space, the focus is solidly on conditionality still. And when you look at this book quote, I have the title of a book here, which came out some years back. Many people perceive this agenda of the EU, the enlargement and even neighborhood policy, as a policy of promoting regime change. They react against that to a certain extent, but sometimes they accept it. To what extent changing policies and regime has been at the heart of perceptions when for the EU has been working in different countries? Well, not always. Looking at Egypt before the Arab Spring, there were programs on civil society reform, but as the evaluation showed, the focus on human rights and so on was not the central one in the policy program or the cooperation program with Egypt. So the future of conditionality, to what extent it will be adapted in different contexts, is going to be a prominent part of the discussion on the NGO level, and I assume in the European and national parliaments as we proceed. So it illustrates a little bit of the complexities of the debate. This was a quick overview of the content of the European Global Strategy document. those elements that refer to human rights and democracy. Obviously, there's much more to it than this. There are many indirect references in the document to these issues. This is a long document, about 15,000 words. But maybe what I've done does at least give you a precursor to the debate that you might wish to engage in. So I hope that this briefing does meet your requirements to get a precursor for the discussion of NGO advocacy in relation to the European Union global strategy. I certainly am convinced personally that we as NGOs, if I may put myself in that position, will only be effective if we have a comprehensive perspective, both of security and human rights and cooperation. And on the other hand, that we also know the detail, we know the context in the different countries. Not an easy thing to do for people who may not have access to all the necessary information or time to take it in. But I hope that this can at least simplify your analysis. Thank you very much. And look out for more of this nature. I will publish briefings from different perspectives here. And it might be useful for you as NGOs also to look at how others perceive the debate. So I will be looking at it from different perspectives, including the military, including enlargement, including development and security and so on. Thank you very much again.